from Massachusetts to Georgia, but wherever they went, it was always the same. They were unwelcome aliens, hated for their French language, their Catholic faith, and their refusal to be absorbed by the Anglo-American culture.
Quand les Acadiens ont été déportés, l'idée de Charles Lawrence, c'était de disperser ces gens-là en petites poches de société pour qu'il y ait plus un peuple qui s'appelle Acadien ou qui se considère Acadien, mais ils avaient mal compris la profondeur de ce sens d'identité qui avait commencé à cause du fait que c'était des gens qui se connaissaient déjà avant de partir, même de la France. Donc, quand ils ont essayé de les disperser pour briser la société, rendu là, en 1755, c'était impossible. Le sens d'identité était déjà trop fort.
Nearly 1,000 exiles were sent to Maryland. Within a few years, their number had dwindled by as much as a third. Their kinsmen in Virginia faced even greater trials.
These exiles contracted smallpox, one of the two great scourges of the 18th century, a disease they hadn't encountered in predispersal Acadia. So as a consequence, when they arrived in Virginia, the colonial government refused to allow them to debark. They remained aboard the ship in quarantine, and the disease just decimated the ranks of the exiles. It was eventually decided by the government that they should be shipped elsewhere because they would never be given entry because of the epidemic. So the ships were ordered to sail for England, and during the passage, two of the ships sank. The survivors made their way to England at British seaports where they were placed in detention centers. Those who did survive were sent by the British to French seaports in 1763.
During the exile, the dislocation and loss of life was so great that the Acadian population of both the Canadian Maritimes and Louisiana combined is but a small fraction of the 7 million demographers estimate it would be today had the Grand Dérangement, the deportation, never occurred.
The Acadians had a remarkable communications network during the exile. At the height of the dispersal, there were Acadians living in France, there were Acadians in the Falkland Islands, Acadians in the northern coast of South America, in the West Indies, scattered along the eastern seaboard, in Quebec. The fact of the matter, though, was that the Acadians were able to communicate with one another. Each of these communities managed somehow to communicate with relatives elsewhere in the world.
Acadians began arriving in Louisiana from the British colonies, especially Maryland and Pennsylvania. Nearly a generation later, the largest group, the Acadian exiles in France, immigrated as a community. The Spanish government in Louisiana provided each Acadian family with land, tools, seeds to plant, and a musket. The settlers began building farms and cattle ranches, and within a few years they had achieved the quality of life comparable to the one that they had left behind in Acadie. Beausoleil Broussard had led his people to this fertile grassland in the spring of 1765. That autumn, he was laid to rest. But he had lived to witness the founding of a new settlement, a new homeland, and the birth of a new Acadie. The Acadians had to adapt to the subtropical climate of Louisiana. It changed the food they ate, the crops that they grew, the way they built their houses, and even the clothes they wore. But in many ways, Nouvelle Acadie was not unlike the old.
The people who became the Acadians when they came from France, they didn't forget everything they knew. And they didn't forget, the way they lived when they crossed the Atlantic, just as they didn't forget what they had developed when they came down to Louisiana after the exile. They had a way of building houses. They had a way of cooking. They had a way of, they had songs they sang. They carried in their collective memories, stories they told.
Capitaine avec mes sabots, ils m'ont appelé vilaine avec mes sabots d'Andaine. Oh, oh, oh.
The women were so important that they were really the link between the ancestors and the future generation. They had to give to the people that were going to come out of that group. They were just a tiny group at the beginning. And now today we're a people. Where did we get all what we know, our memory? We got it from the transmission given by the women. They would teach the children also how to be French in an English colony, how to remain something that had been great one day. And they were coming here in America, transplanting an ancient culture to a new world.
When Acadian women married non-Acadian men, they acculturated them into their own French-speaking community. The children of these outsiders became French-speaking Acadians. This was especially true after the Civil War. But rather than diluting Acadian identity, this served to enrich and to diversify it. And that's why today we have Cajuns with family names like Romero, Shake Snyder, Huffpower, Reed, and McGee.
When the Acadians arrived, all of the exiles arrived with virtually nothing. But over the following century, you see the accumulation of wealth in the hands of certain families. And these families, by the time of the Civil War, are some of the most wealthy families in South Louisiana. The vast majority of Acadians, however, remained petits habitants, or essentially yeoman farmers, pursuing a way of life that had changed little from the time of their forefathers. So you see two polar extremes developing in the Acadian community, two distinct communities emerging by the time of the Civil War.
Il y avait des Acadiens qui avaient monté l'échelle sociale, arrivés jusqu'à la guerre de sécession. Et il y avait des plantations et pour eux, la guerre voulait dire quelque chose. Mais la plupart des Cajuns, les petits habitants, ils n'avaient rien à voir. Il n'y avait pas d'esclaves et ils travaillaient leur petite terre eux-mêmes et s'ils n'étaient pas là, le travail n'était pas fait. Ça fait pour eux, la guerre voulait absolument rien dire. C'était un embarras. The Civil War was a major turning point for French Creole society. They saw in the Civil War the possibility that they might be able to preserve their specificity, their Frenchness, their French culture and language, which they had valiantly tried to preserve through several rewrites of the Constitution, several renegotiations of a place for themselves in what came to be called Louisiana. With the end of the Civil War, and with the elimination of the possibility of seceding, they finally got the message, and they were not going to, they knew that they understood that they were not going to be able to escape becoming part of the United States of America and all that implied. And the language of the future was English, and the economy of the future was American, and they began to make the transition right after the Civil War. They began to send their children to English language schools, and they began to participate in the economy in a way that they had not done before. And the Cajuns, on the other hand, just very simply didn't get the message. They weren't plugged into the same economic and political and social systems.
A century before, Acadians had resisted giving their allegiance to imperial powers and refused to bear arms in their wars. Much like their ancestors, the petits habitants considered themselves French neutrals and took no interest in la guerre des confédérés, the Confederate War. But the South needed soldiers desperately and began conscripting Acadian farmers in great numbers.
Quand ça arrivait pour les mettre dans l'armée, il fallait les conscrire. Il fallait les forcer de rentrer dans l'armée. Et même là, arriver dans l'armée, s'ils n'étaient pas assez loin pour les empêcher de rentrer à pied, ils partaient et puis rentraient chez eux. Et il y avait tout un système qu'on avait développé, surtout dans les mèches et dans les bois, pour les cacher. Il fallait qu'ils se cachent non seulement des Yankees du Nord, mais aussi du Sud qui essayaient de les retrouver pour les remettre dans l'armée. Alors ils avaient besoin de les cacher des deux bords.
When the Union Army invaded southwest Louisiana, some Acadians greeted them as liberators. But they soon came to detest these troops as much as they did the Confederates. Union forces swept through their homeland, taking the Acadians' food, their horses, and as many as 10,000 head of cattle. Caught in the middle of a war between two American armies, Nouvelle-Acadie was virtually destroyed. The Acadians had come to Louisiana nearly a half-century before it became part of the United States, remaining almost a nation unto themselves. But with the Civil War, America had come to them, and a great wave of cultural change was rolling toward Nouvelle-Acadie.
The aftermath of the Civil War was really a very difficult time for the Acadian population. There was tremendous devastation wrought by the war. The Confederate Army used the area as a foraging area. The Union Army used the area as a foraging area. Both sides attempted to take food stocks and other goods out of the area, and the result was widespread devastation. As a result of the devastation and a series of years in which there was unseasonable weather, natural disasters, including floods on the scale of the 1927 flood, and labor problems, many farmers in the area were reduced from the status of freeholders to tenant farmers.
The great majority of Acadians living in Louisiana were uneducated, poor, and alienated from an increasingly modern, increasingly Americanized society. These Cajuns, as they were called, became an object of ridicule to the rest of the country.
Dans la plupart des commentaires, aussi bien par les politiciens que par les journalistes, que par tous les gens qui ont observé les Cajuns, systématiquement, ils trouvaient que les Cajuns étaient paresseux et sans ambition. Et c'est intéressant de considérer pourquoi ils pensaient ça, parce que les Américains avaient comme une notion de l'économie qui était basée sur la progression, sur l'acquisition de beaucoup d'argent et de propriétés, alors que la plus grande partie des Cajuns, c'était simplement des gens qui étaient tout à fait heureux de faire leur petite ferme, donner à manger à leur famille, juste avoir assez pour faire la vie.
The Cajuns were viewed as little different from the destitute immigrants arriving in America at that time, even though their families had been in Louisiana since well before the American Revolution. Much like the British over a century before, the Anglo-Americans felt that the best way to deal with the Cajuns was to eliminate their culture and to assimilate them.
All over the world, there was this fierce nationalism that was causing countries to regularize language teaching and regularize social and cultural behavior. In America, you had Teddy Roosevelt saying, you know, there is room for but one language in this country, and that is the English language, for we must assure that the crucible turns out Americans and not some random dwellers in a polyglot boarding house. He was also saying things like, there's no such thing as a hyphenated American. There's no such thing as a French American or a German American or a Spanish American. If he said, if you feel French or German or Spanish, go home. You know, we have something new happening here. And this nationalist movement led to the well-known story in Louisiana of outlawing French in the schools at the same time as free, mandatory public education was made available for the first time in the history of the Acadians. So for the first time in their history, they find themselves obliged to go to school, and in the same motion, forbidden to speak French in those schools.
The most profound change in Acadian society in the early 20th century was the result of the compulsory education law of 1916. Cajun children were ridiculed and beaten in schools in a systematic effort to eradicate their language. An entire generation of Cajuns was taught to believe that their French-speaking culture made them inferior to other Americans.
These kids were being told at school that the language they learned at home was not only useless, it was a social problem. It was a stigma.
J'ai été né à parler français. J'ai appris l'anglais quand j'étais à l'école. Je me rappelle comment m'a essayé de me commencer à morcer de certaines paroles en anglais que fallait je connais quand j'ai commencé l'école. Pour moi, c'était assez dur. Je n'aurais jamais pu apprendre ça. Je dis, maman, je ne pourrais jamais apprendre ça. C'est trop dur pour moi. Et on ne pouvait pas parler français naturellement sur la cour d'école. Si le principal nous attrapait. Mais on se cachait, on parlait en français entre nous autres, tu comprends? Si on voyait les maîtresses venir ou le principal, ouais, naturellement, on se taisait.
C'est moi, mon père parlait seulement en français, ma mère parlait seulement en français. J'avais un vieux oncle qui avait venu rester avec nous autres. On parlait seulement en français. Tous les voisins, tous les petits amis, quand on revenait de l'école, on parlait en français. On parlait en français dessus la cour de l'école quand ça ne nous attrapait pas.
Ouais, si ça nous attrapait, après parler français, on était baptisés. Le premier. La première fois, ça nous attrapait. Plus ou moins, on était punis. Des fois, on avait des lignes à écrire, qu'on n'aurait pas parlé français sur la table d'école, des affaires comme ça. Mais là, si tu étais attrapé encore, des fois, tu étais bûché.
The Cajuns were not alone in the struggle to preserve their language and heritage. Their cultural counterparts, the Black Creoles of Louisiana, shared the same experience.
Je sais qu'avec mon père et avec mes grands-parents, avec mes tantes et mes oncles surtout, ils étaient élevés à l'époque où il y avait beaucoup de pression, surtout, je crois, sur le monde de couleur, qu'il fallait que tout le monde parle anglais, que tout le monde devenir comme les Américains.
The arrival of the railroad revolutionized travel in South Louisiana. Before the arrival of the railroad, everything was based on water communications, primarily with New Orleans. Before the arrival of the railroad, the Prairie region had been a real backwater. The arrival of the railroad brought the late 19th century directly to the Cajun prairies. The population within a 10-mile radius of the railroad was directly affected. Many pockets of traditional culture, however, remained in the area. This was a direct result of social isolation, which in fact was a form of resistance against modernization.
But if American influences were trickling into Cajun society, nothing prepared it for the flood of change that would come with the discovery of oil.
Oil provided the strongest catalyst for change, the strongest economic incentive, because a farmer could make more in one day as a roughneck in the oil industry, working in the Bosco fields, than he could working in a month as a day laborer in the area. It provided tremendous economic incentive for change. And the oil industry was dominated by Anglo immigrants, primarily from Oklahoma and Texas. Advancement in the oil industry was predicated upon one's ability to function in that English language culture. And this provides a strong economic incentive for people to move into the Anglo-American mainstream.
During World War I, during this nationalistic period, with the exclusion of the French language on school grounds, punishing kids, humiliating kids, forcing them into a position where the first few weeks of school they had to wet their pants every day because they didn't know how to ask for permission to go to the bathroom in English, and they weren't allowed to ask in French. And a language that causes you to humiliate yourself in that way, causes you to be punished, write 1,000 times, I will not speak French on the school grounds, wear a sign that, calling attention to yourself as a fool. You want to distance yourself from that language as fast as possible. But then the same generation finds themselves fighting World War II. And many of them found themselves in the European theater in France. And it occurred to me that many of them, that this language that they were told wasn't even real French and it was worthless, worked just fine. Especially when talking to French peasants and ordinary people in the marketplace and trying to get a date with this pretty girl or get a bottle of wine or a dry place to sleep. And their superiors noticed this right away. You know, these people can speak to the natives. And so they became interpreters.
World War II had a huge impact on Cajun society, and I'd say it's one of the three most important events in the entire sweep of Acadian history from 1604 to the present. First of all, you had all Cajun males from the ages of 18 to 36 being susceptible to the draft, so they were being picked up by Uncle Sam and being sent to camps and God knows where for basic training, and there no one spoke French. They were expected to speak English. Maybe some of these guys had never been away from their hometowns before or past the parish line. So all of a sudden they're immersed in this English-speaking world, and they had to learn to speak English in order to stay alive.
These GIs who came back home after World War II, they were the ones who were populating the bars and the dance halls, trying to dance and drink and forget their troubles. What they wanted was to hear traditional Cajun music, and they wanted to be home, and they wanted to have their traditional, and they're the ones who said, you know what? This language they told us wasn't real French works. And they began to reconsider the whole thing. In fact, if there was a nationalistic movement associated with World War I, there was a sort of a regional movement associated with the end of World War II. This is when the Newport Folk Festival was developed. There was a celebration, a search for diversity in America. We became, as a country, afraid of all looking alike and sounding alike and being alike. And so we began to explore our own diversity. In that exploration, in the 50s and 60s, the Cajuns played a major part. The Cajuns were invited to the 1964 Newport Folk Festival. Dewey Balfa and Gladys Thibodeau and Vinus Lejeune went up there. And the feeling here was that they were going up there to get laughed at. But when they got up there, they were considered instead heroes of cultural preservation as early as the late 40s, in fact. Even before the Newport Folk Festival, you had people like Ira Lejeune, Lawrence Walker, Aldous Roger, Austin Peete, Dewey Balfa, people like that leading a reconsideration of what was valuable in the culture and by association in the language.
While the musicians waged a war of resistance on stage, others were taking up the fight on other fronts. Politician and activist Jimmy DiMaggio founded the Council for the Development of French in Louisiana, Codeville, with a radical new mission now written into state law.
The Council for the Development of French in Louisiana had in the early going, had a very elitist approach to things. It was saving French from the top down with schools and with, social clubs and that kind of thing. Whereas there was a grassroots surge that was looking to happen. And it happened under the leadership of musicians. It was in 1974 that we put together the first Cajun Music Festival. It was the first expression of grassroots support, this surge of cultural, social power that came up from the bottom and said, we are concerned about this. We're interested in this. This is important to us. And it was celebrated with music. And it continued to be celebrated with music through things like festivals and Dewey Balfa's Folk Artists in the Schools program. And eventually, Codeville married the two. Jimmy DiMaggio, the president of Codeville, was very perceptive. He noticed that language doesn't exist in a vacuum. You can't just preserve French. You have to preserve something to do in French. French has to make you laugh and dance and cry, and it has to be part of your life. So this cultural movement emerged alongside this linguistic educational movement.